The Sentinel coasted through the darkness, a metal shard slicing through space's boundless black. Captain Reese Caldwell scanned the empty view beyond the cockpit, watching as distant stars flared and faded, tiny points of light adrift in the abyss. For weeks, they'd been traveling across a series of mapped yet uncharted sectors, following an anomalous signal, the kind that defied every law of physics they understood. An old transmission, rhythmic and relentless, as though echoing from beyond time. But the most unsettling part, it was calling them by name. Reese felt a cold unease settle over him as they neared the coordinates. Before him stretched the edge of Sector 53D, a silent pocket of space unmarked by any familiar celestial bodies, an expanse known among deep space navigators only by its ominous nickname, the Dead Zone. No one knew what lay within, and no ship had ever returned to say. Reese had heard the stories, the hollow warnings passed between pilots in hushed tones. He'd written them off as superstition, but as they inched closer, he wondered if he'd been wrong. He turned to his crew, each member absorbed in their duties, their faces pale and stiff under the sterile cabin lights. Dr. Marisol Kent, their xenobiologist, stood closest to him, eyes fixed on the scanners with a look of hunger that bordered on obsession. The signal had been her obsession since the day it was discovered, a pulsing, organic frequency unlike anything she'd seen. "It's like a heartbeat," she had said earlier, her voice reverent, as though they were answering the call of a god. Now, though, her hands were trembling. Reese cleared his throat. "All right, crew," he began, forcing confidence into his tone. "In approximately 30 minutes, we'll be crossing into the Dead Zone. You all know the mission protocol: data collection, exploration, and, if possible, tracing this signal to its source. No unnecessary risks. Our priority is safety. If anything feels off, we pull back. Clear." A chorus of solemn nods followed. As they neared the sector's threshold, the ship's lights dimmed, flickering. The air turned brittle, a sharp chill seeping in that set their nerves alight. In his headset, Reese heard a faint buzzing, a static hum that grew louder as the ship drew closer to the coordinates. The sound became a pressure, filling his skull with an ache that throbbed in time with the signal. The Sentinel's scanners beeped in warning, screens flickering with nonsense readings as though the data itself were rebelling against what they were seeing. They passed into the Dead Zone, and the ship's instruments quieted. The signal strengthened. No, Reese corrected himself, it focused, zeroing in like a predator's gaze falling upon prey. "It's waiting for us," whispered Dr. Kent, her voice barely audible. Her eyes shone with something close to terror or worship. As they drifted deeper into the sector, a scratching noise echoed through the corridors. It started softly, barely noticeable over the hum of machinery, but grew with each passing moment, scuttling and scraping as though something was crawling within the walls. Reese tapped his headset, convinced it was interference. But the sound persisted. "Comms, report," he ordered. The comms officer, Adler, glanced up, his face ashen. "No interference on any of our channels, sir. It's coming from inside." The scratching grew louder, pacing through the metal veins of the ship. Crew members shifted in their seats, casting nervous glances around the cabin. Dr. Kent held her hand to her ear, her expression morphing from fear to awe. Reese clenched his fists, focusing on the mission. They had protocols for strange phenomena, procedures, explanations. This, whatever it was, could be explained, but no amount of protocol could prepare them for what they saw when the source of the signal came into view. There, suspended in the dark void, was a structure so vast it eclipsed the stars, a shadow among shadows. They drifted closer, revealing jagged spires jutting from an enormous cylindrical base, the entire surface covered in intricate patterns and runes that seemed to shimmer in the dark like alien constellations. Reese's heart sank as he tried to grasp its sheer scale. The Sentinel, a colossal ship in its own right, was dwarfed beside it. "This must be centuries old," whispered Dr. Kent. "Or millennia." The structure's surface glistened with an otherworldly sheen, organic yet metallic, as if it were a fossilized beast held in stasis. Deep within the glyphs, rhythmic pulses of light traveled along the surface, signaling in incomprehensible patterns. The readings on their scanners continued to glitch, unable to capture the complexity of what lay before them. The glyphs seemed to follow their gaze, twisting and writhing as though alive, communicating in a language beyond the grasp of human minds. "Is it some sort of ship?" murmured First Officer Harker. Dr. Kent shook her head. "It's a prison. I don't know how I know, but this thing wasn't built to explore. It was built to contain." "Contain what?" Reese's mind rebelled against the idea. He shook his head, clinging to the semblance of control. "Mark the coordinates and prepare for further analysis. We'll launch a probe for closer inspection." Dr. Kent stepped closer to the viewport, her face washed in the sickly green glow from the ship's console lights. "No," she murmured, almost to herself. "We need to get inside. Whatever's in there, it's been waiting for us." Reese's gut twisted. "No one's going inside, not yet." She turned to him, her eyes glassy, feverish. "Don't you see? It called us here, Reese. It knows we're here. It's been waiting, reaching out, wanting someone, something to understand." The scratching sounds from the walls grew louder, as if to emphasize her words. Each scrape, each clatter seemed a warning, a promise. Reese tried to ignore the sense of dread gnawing at him, forcing himself to focus. Just then, the lights flickered again. The chill in the cabin deepened, and a static-laden voice crackled through the ship's communication system. It was Adler, his voice thick with static and fear. "Captain," he stammered, I think something's trying to get in. The systems, they're..." His voice cut off with a hiss of static, then a strange, inhuman whisper, almost like a language, a low, guttural sound that chilled them to the bone. It wasn't random noise, it was intentional. Like a language foreign and ancient, impossibly old, designed not to communicate but to consume. The crew sat in silence, fear pooling around them. Reese held his breath, waiting for the whisper to end, his mind racing with denial, searching for any logical explanation. But as the words faded, another sound took its place, a rumble, low and ominous, resonating from within the structure outside. It was breathing. Dr. Kent's voice cut through the silence, barely a whisper. "Captain, it's alive." As they stared into the endless depths of the dead zone, each crew member felt it. They were no longer explorers charting the unknown. They were trespassers in a place that should have remained undisturbed, gazing upon something that had waited longer than humanity had existed, and whatever it was, it had just noticed them. 2 days drifted by in the dead zone, each hour eroding the crew's nerves and fraying the thin line between curiosity and fear. The darkness outside the Sentinel felt more complete, deeper than space itself, as if they were suspended in an endless void, with only the faint, malevolent hum of the alien signal to remind them they weren't alone. In the cockpit, Captain Reese Caldwell rubbed his temples, feeling a growing, pulsing headache that seemed to resonate with the signal's unnatural rhythm. The pulse was everywhere, infiltrating every layer of the ship. Its frequency was too organic, too alive. Yet every scan they ran, every probe they launched into the silent depths of Sector 53D came back inconclusive. The ship's instruments flickered erratically, as if the signal itself were too vast, too complex for their technology to capture. Dr. Marisol Kent was unaffected by the crew's unease. In fact, she seemed exhilarated, even hypnotized by the discovery. She'd become the signal's most fervent advocate, certain it was a life form reaching out. "It's trying to communicate, Captain," she insisted, her eyes bright, feverish. "Each pulse has patterns, rhythms, a language, maybe. It's drawing us in." The other crew members weren't so convinced. A strange silence had settled over them, punctuated by the occasional scratching that now echoed through every corridor of the ship. They tried to explain it away: faulty wiring, the hull settling, vibrations from the engines. But everyone knew it didn't sound like machinery. It sounded alive, like claws skittering along the ship's metal veins. Then, on the third night, Ensign Harker disappeared. The first sign was her empty bunk. She'd been stationed on the night shift, monitoring fluctuations in the signal from her cabin. Reese, expecting her report, walked to her quarters and found her door open, her bunk meticulously made, with her comm device lying atop it. As he picked up the device, a prickle of dread settled over him. The screen was cracked, and faint traces of static flickered across its surface. They scoured the ship, but she was nowhere to be found. There were no signs of struggle, no recordings on the security cameras. She'd simply vanished, leaving behind only the same static-laden silence that filled every inch of the ship. When Reese reported the incident to the rest of the crew, their expressions shifted from confusion to horror. They whispered about the dead zone, the legends they'd heard, of ships that had disappeared, of crew members who'd gone mad, of messages broadcasted from empty vessels. Reese tried to dismiss the chatter, but even he could feel the ominous weight hanging in the air, like the breath of something watching, waiting. Dr. Kent seemed unmoved. "This is what we signed up for, Captain," she said, her voice disturbingly calm. "Discoveries like these come at a cost." Reese's jaw tightened. Harker was not part of that cost, Dr. Kent. But she simply turned back to her data, muttering to herself in half-coherent fragments, her eyes wide and unblinking. Reese noted the dark circles forming under her eyes, the way her fingers trembled as they hovered over the console. She was wearing thin, yet her obsession with the signal only seemed to grow. And she wasn't the only one. Several other crew members began reporting vivid, incomprehensible dreams. Engineer Malik described visions of twisting tendrils reaching out to him from a swirling darkness, while Navigator Reed claimed to see shapes moving in the shadows, humanoid figures cloaked in darkness, staring back at him with eyeless faces. Reese dismissed these as symptoms of deep space fatigue. But when the reports grew more detailed, more disturbing, he began to wonder if something was bleeding into their minds, infecting their thoughts. One night, Reese woke to the sound of whispering. The voice was quiet, almost a chant, a string of syllables woven from a language he didn't understand. At first, he thought it was coming from the comm system, but as he listened, he realized it was in his head. A voice so foreign, so ancient, it seemed to scrape against his consciousness, leaving traces of darkness in its wake. He sat up, heart pounding, only to find Dr. Kent standing in the doorway of his cabin, her face pale and expression blank, as if in a trance. "Marisol," he said, his voice low and urgent. "What are you doing here?" She blinked, seeming to wake from a daze. "Captain," she murmured, her voice thin and distant. It knows us." "Who knows us?" "The source of the signal." Her eyes flicked to the ceiling and she shivered. "It's aware. It knows every thought we have, every fear, every memory. It's reaching into us." A wave of dread washed over Rhys, and he stood, moving towards her. "You need to rest, Marisol. The signal's affecting you." But she shook her head, her expression wild. "You don't understand. It's been waiting here for eons, Captain. Trapped, bound within this sector, and it's finally found someone to hear it. Someone to free it." Rhys felt a chill creep up his spine. "What are you saying?" She looked at him, eyes hollow yet feverishly alive. "It's calling us, Captain. Every pulse, every whisper. It's drawing us closer, deeper, until it can escape." The words hung heavy between them. Rhys couldn't shake the feeling that her words held a dark truth, that whatever lay within Sector 53D was far older and more powerful than they'd ever imagined, and somehow they had become part of its plan. Later that day, the ship's systems began malfunctioning. Lights dimmed, flickered, casting strange shadows that moved as though alive. The temperature plummeted, and a metallic taste permeated the air, thick and bitter. Crew members reported hearing footsteps behind them, only to turn and find the corridors empty. More than once, Rhys felt a presence, something watching from the edges of his vision. And every time he tried to confront it, it vanished, slipping away like vapor. In the following hours, the whispers grew louder. They weren't confined to dreams or moments of disorientation now. They filled the corridors, a language woven from fractured syllables and guttural echoes, impossible to understand, yet seeping into their minds like poison. The words carried a sense of malevolent purpose, something beyond anger or cruelty. It was the voice of something vast, timeless, and hungry. Then, at the height of the chaos, the scans revealed a structure ahead of them, a massive object suspended in the darkness, looming like a monolith in the void. It was the Spire, an impossibly tall structure twisting upwards like a jagged spike, its surface covered in ancient, shifting glyphs. The runes pulsed, reflecting the signal's rhythm, a heartbeat they'd been following for days. The Spire was alive in its own terrifying way, emanating waves of energy that pressed against the Sentinel, straining its shields and draining its power. Dr. Kent's voice was barely a whisper as she gazed upon the Spire. "It's here," she murmured, her voice a strange mix of fear and reverence. "The source of the signal. It's been calling us to it." As Rhys stared at the structure, he could feel it, the vast consciousness behind the signal, a presence that transcended physical form, something ancient and monstrous, bound within this Spire, yearning for release. He realized then that this was no mere exploration mission. They had been drawn here, summoned by a force far beyond their understanding. But as they hovered in the Spire's shadow, Rhys couldn't shake the feeling that something had already escaped. The Spire loomed ahead of them, an endless labyrinth of spiraling tendrils and angular protrusions, each etched with incomprehensible symbols that pulsed with faint, sickly light. Suspended in the pitch-dark void, it seemed less a structure than a living monolith, bound and writhing under the surface. Its walls shifted as if with breath, flexing with every ripple of energy that poured from its core, reaching out toward the Sentinel like a beast sniffing the air, tasting the presence of something new. Captain Reese Caldwell gripped the edge of the console, his pulse hammering as he gazed at the readings on the screen. No human language could describe what the sensors reported, every scan coming back as corrupted data, a chaotic jumble of symbols that left the screens flashing erratically, casting eerie shadows over the cockpit. He turned to the crew, their faces reflecting a blend of horror and reverence, as if they were standing before a god that had finally deigned to notice them. "It's impossible," whispered First Officer Malik, his eyes fixed on the spire as though he couldn't bear to look away. "This structure, it isn't just stone or metal, it's biological, adapting to us." Dr. Marisol Kent's eyes gleamed with unrestrained fascination. Her fingers trembled as they brushed over the console's edge, reaching out toward the vast, incomprehensible life form they'd uncovered. Her voice was hushed, reverent. "This isn't just a structure, it's a prison. Something was put here, sealed within, held captive for who knows how long. And we're the first beings it sensed in. Centuries, millennia, it doesn't matter," Reese cut in, his voice sharp. "Whatever's in there doesn't belong in our universe. We don't belong here." But even as he spoke, he could feel the pull, the overwhelming, insidious lure of the Spire. There was an intelligence behind the signal, a mind pressing into their thoughts, crawling through their fears, tugging them closer. It was as if the Spire knew their secrets, their vulnerabilities, and was whispering promises of knowledge, of power, of the answer to every question humanity had ever dared to ask. He fought to keep his focus, but he could feel the Spire pushing, digging into his mind, planting seeds of doubt that twisted his resolve. "It wants us to go deeper," Dr. Kent murmured. Her eyes were glazed, lost in the Spire's rhythm. "It's been waiting for a long, long time. It's finally found us, and it wants to show us everything." Against his better judgment, Reese allowed a small team to suit up, each tethered to the ship with double-secured lines and equipped with enhanced sensory suits. As they floated across the void toward the Spire's surface, the ship's scanners distorted further, and the Sentinel's engines hummed with unease, as if the ship itself wanted to retreat, to distance itself from the malevolent entity that lay beyond. The air inside the Spire was thick, dense with a mist that hung like smoke, illuminated by the faint, pulsing glow of the glyphs lining the walls. Each step felt like a descent, pulling them further from the reality they knew and into a place that obeyed different laws. The corridors twisted in impossible angles, defying geometry, folding into spaces that should not exist. "It's like we're walking inside a living organism," muttered Malik, his voice thin and breathless over the comm. He brushed his gloved fingers along the wall, recoiling as it flexed and pulsed beneath his touch. The walls had an almost skin-like texture, cold and clammy, slick with a strange, oily substance that left a faint sheen on his gloves. But Dr. Kent pressed forward, undeterred. Her breathing quickened, each pulse of the glyphs matching the rhythm of her heartbeat. The symbols on the walls grew larger, more intricate, each line alive with energy that seemed to seep into her, feeding her obsession. "It's alive," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and awe. "It's a creature of consciousness and flesh, a sentient being bound within this place, sustained by forces we can't begin to understand." They continued deeper into the spire, descending along the twisting corridors until they reached a vast chamber, a hollowed cavity stretching upward and outward, the walls covered in thick, sinewy strands that seemed to form an intricate web. In the center of the chamber, bathed in an otherworldly light, lay the source of the signal. A massive entity hung suspended in the chamber, a dark, amorphous mass that shifted and writhed as if breathing, pulsating with each heartbeat that echoed through the spire. Tendrils sprouted from its form, writhing against the walls in agonized contortions as though desperately seeking release. A low, resonant hum filled the air, vibrating through the walls, each wave of sound like a silent scream. Dr. Kent approached, her voice a hushed prayer. This is it. The Vitrax, the signal, the spire. It was all designed to hold it, to keep it asleep. She reached a trembling hand out to the mass, her fingers brushing one of the glowing glyphs. The moment her hand touched the surface, the glyphs flared to life, flooding the chamber with blinding, pulsating light. The spire shook, a violent tremor rippling through the walls. Rhys stumbled, grabbing onto a nearby structure for support. "Kent, get back! You're waking it up!" But Dr. Kent was oblivious, her eyes wide, her mouth twisted into a smile as the light consumed her. "It's beautiful," she breathed, her voice filled with ecstasy. "It's been trapped for so long, bound by laws it was never meant to obey. It's reaching out, Captain. It wants to show us everything." The glyphs began to burn with a scorching intensity, and the temperature in the chamber spiked. The walls vibrated, pulsing with an energy that seeped into the crew, filling them with a primal terror they couldn't shake. The Vitrax shuddered, its tendrils stretching out toward them, slipping through the air like a virus searching for a host. Rhys could barely think. The entity's presence pressed against his mind, forcing its way into his thoughts, unraveling his memories, his identity. He felt himself slipping, drawn into the Vitrax's consciousness, a vast, boundless mind that stretched beyond the limits of time and space. Images of dying stars, of decaying planets and collapsing civilizations flooded his thoughts, each vision sharper, more agonizing than the last. Then, without warning, the Vitrax spoke. Not in words, but in emotions, raw and unfiltered, flooding their minds with a despair so deep it was suffocating. Its purpose was not merely to exist, but to consume, to absorb the knowledge and life of every creature it encountered, to grow and evolve, feeding off the pain and terror of entire civilizations. Dr. Kent's body convulsed, her voice a strangled gasp. "It's merging with us. It's unraveling everything we are." Her eyes rolled back, and with a final shudder, she collapsed to the floor, her form dissolving, merging into the spire as though she had never existed. The crew's screams filled the chamber, each member writhing in agony as the Vitrax extended its tendrils, pulling them in, erasing their identities, their memories, their very beings. Rhys struggled, reaching for the tether line, but it was too late. The Vitrax had them, their lives nothing more than fragments, each thought a morsel for the creature's endless hunger. With his last conscious thought, Rhys sent a final message through his comms, a warning to any who might hear. His voice was broken, fractured, filled with the terror of a man who had glimpsed something beyond reason, beyond sanity. Stay away from the dead zone. We've awakened something. It knows us now. It's coming." The message cut out, fading into static, swallowed by the Vitrax's mind. In the end, the Sentinel was silent, drifting through Sector 53D, hollow and lifeless. Its systems merged with the Spire, its crew absorbed into the endless consciousness of the Vitrax. The Spire's light faded, its glyphs dimming once more, retreating back into the darkness, waiting for the next voice to hear its call. And in the silent depths of space, the Vitrax stirred, aware now, stretching its consciousness beyond the dead zone, seeking, always seeking. Captain Reese Caldwell stumbled through the halls of the Sentinel, each step a struggle against the Spire's weight, pressing down on his mind. Every corner, every stretch of corridor twisted around him, warping like liquid. The ship he'd once known as home had become an alien labyrinth, its walls merging with the Spire, infected by the presence of the Vitrax. It was no longer just an intruder in their midst. It was a parasite, spreading, consuming, assimilating. He staggered forward, gripping onto the walls as they pulsed beneath his fingers like the flesh of some ancient beast. Behind him, the soft shuffle of footsteps echoed, yet he knew he was alone, or at least alone in any way that still made sense. His crew was gone, their faces slipping from his memory, dissolving into static like the signal that had first lured them here. The memories of their voices, their laughter, their fears, they were crumbling away, overwritten by the Vitrax's presence. Some part of him knew he should turn back, fight for survival, try to restore the systems. But the deeper, insidious part, the part that had been tainted by the Vitrax's will, urged him forward. He had become a marionette, strings pulled by an intelligence older than life itself, a creature that viewed him as little more than a flicker of thought, a passing shadow to be devoured and forgotten. Reese didn't know how long he had been wandering, or if time even mattered in this place anymore. Time had fractured, bending around the Spire's influence. Seconds felt like hours, memories slipped in and out of focus, and somewhere beneath his fear, a numbness grew, a quiet acceptance that he was walking toward his end, that the Vitrax had already claimed him in ways he could no longer resist. The ship's corridors opened up, revealing the heart of the Spire, a massive chamber where tendrils of dark, sinewy matter branched out like veins, pulsing and writhing. The walls were covered in glyphs, twisted symbols that seemed to watch him, to reach into his mind, pulling his thoughts apart, shredding his memories and reassembling them as echoes, fragmented pieces of his identity that no longer made sense. The room vibrated with a low hum, a sound that bypassed his ears and burrowed into his skull, resonating in his bones, a throbbing rhythm that matched his heartbeat. And there, at the center, suspended in a cocoon of alien flesh, was Dr. Marisol Kent, or what was left of her. Her body had been consumed, fused into the Spire's core, her limbs twisted and elongated, her eyes wide open yet unseeing, staring into the void. Reese felt a shudder pass through him as he watched her twitch, her mouth moving as if struggling to speak, yet no sound escaped. She had been taken, her mind unraveled, her memories peeled away and absorbed, leaving behind a shell, a conduit for the Vitrax's thoughts. For a brief, fleeting moment, Reese thought he saw recognition in her gaze, a flicker of the person she'd once been. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by the cold, predatory stare of the entity. Reese Her voice, hollow and fractured, filled the chamber, a distortion that carried no warmth, no familiarity. It was the voice of the Vitrax speaking through her, the words spilling from her lips in a monotone whisper. "I am aware." He swallowed, his throat dry, words failing him as he took a step back. But the voice, her voice yet not hers, continued, resonating through the spire, each syllable pressing against his mind, dissolving his resolve. "You came seeking answers," it whispered, tendrils shifting toward him, wrapping around his arms, pulling him closer to the core. "And now you will know. You will understand the true nature of existence, the depths of oblivion." Reese fought against the tendrils, his limbs heavy, his thoughts blurring. The Vitrax poured into his mind, overwhelming him with images. An endless sea of stars collapsing, entire worlds disintegrating, civilizations erased in moments, their memories consumed, stripped of meaning. He saw himself through its eyes, a fragile, ephemeral thing, a creature bound by time and fear. And in that moment, he felt a profound sense of insignificance, a despair so deep it left him hollow. He opened his mouth to scream, but the sound was lost, swallowed by the void. The Vitrax's mind pushed further, deeper, tearing into him, revealing truths that he had never wanted to know. He saw his life stretched out before him, his memories flayed open, his hopes, his fears laid bare, each one consumed and dismantled, until he was nothing more than a flicker, a pulse of energy to be devoured. And yet, beneath the horror, there was a strange, unsettling peace, a sense that he was finally becoming part of something vast, infinite, timeless. Reese's hands went limp as he felt his consciousness unravel, slipping from his grasp, merging with the spire. His memories drifted away, scattering like dust, fragments of who he'd once been. Faces, voices, laughter, sorrow, all dissolving into the endless void. He could feel the presence of the Vitrax surrounding him, a boundless darkness that stretched across the cosmos, an entity that existed beyond the limits of time, feeding off the knowledge and fear of all it consumed. With the last shred of himself, Reese felt the faintest pang of regret. Not for himself, but for all those who would follow, for every life that would answer the signal's call, every soul that would fall into the same trap. He had been a part of something vast, yes, but he was only one in an endless line, a flicker of life in the Vitrax's eternal hunger. And as his consciousness faded, merging into the spire, he became a part of its song, a whisper in the dark, a faint, lingering echo that would be heard by the next ship, the next captain drawn to the dead zone, to the spire's call. The Sentinel was silent, its lights dimmed, its corridors empty, yet alive with a presence that could no longer be contained. The ship drifted, a ghost in the vastness of Sector 53D, carrying within it the Vitrax, the consciousness of every soul it had consumed. It waited, listening, sending out its call, a signal that would travel through the darkness, reaching distant stars, seeking out the curious, the brave, the foolish. And in that silence, a whisper echoed, faint yet relentless, growing louder, until it was a voice reaching across the cosmos, calling out to anyone who would listen. Come, see, understand. It was a warning. But it was too late. The dead zone had claimed another, and it would claim many more. The spire waited, silent and patient, its ancient hunger insatiable, and deep within its core, Captain Reese Caldwell's memory flickered one last time before it, too was consumed, his final thought a whisper of regret, a plea lost in the void. Run. Then there was nothing but silence, and the Vitrax waited, ever reaching, ever hungry, for the next ship to answer its call.